All right, we're gonna kick this off. We may have some more people join us in progress. We might have some people watch this one later because we got a fun topic today. Hi everyone, I'm Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of our Teaching and Learning Center. I'm so excited that you have found our way to our professional development series. As you probably know, we meet at noon on Wednesdays in real time over Zoom throughout the course of the academic year. We also we record these on video and we post the videos on our webpage for asynchronous viewing later. So any of you watching this later, hi, it's good to see you whenever you are. We'll begin today, as we always do, with a land acknowledgement.
Okay, yeah, Don, just give me a thumbs up whenever you see it. Okay, cool. Here we go.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilize the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
These truths,
because we still remember.
Thank you. A couple of announcements before we get going with our event today. Number one, you can earn a professional development certificate if you are a GTA or a faculty or staff member by being part of our professional development series. That information is going to be dropped in the chat by one of my colleagues here soon. If you want to be a fellow of the TLC and you are a faculty member, we also have information at that link about that as well. We have a number of things coming up, including we'll have this second meeting of the Small Teaching Online Book Club, led by Suzanne Parath. The first meeting was a couple weeks ago. It was fantastic on part 1 of the book. Part 2 of the book will be this Friday from 1 to 2 over Zoom in real time. So if anyone is interested in that, we have the information, I believe, on our TLC webpage, but we can also probably drop that information in the chat as well. Really cool. And I'm not telling you not to read, but reading that part is not a prerequisite for having attending the event. So if you don't have time to kind of read that section of the book, we're going to come hear awesome conversation about ways you can teach better online. Definitely show up again, 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock this coming Friday over Zoom. We also have an event coming up next week that we're very excited about supporting first-generation college students. This is an amazing event put on Rebecca Paz and Erica Thompson, and I definitely invite you to come and attend that. And then we have lots of other great events the rest of the semester. Our event today, I think, is going to be awesome, and I would introduce the speaker, but it's me. So I'm going to be talking to you today about TEVALs 101. This is a super important topic that we've got to kind of talk about. Sometimes we're a little ambivalent about TEVALs and those sorts of things, and I'm going to talk to you a lot about that. I definitely recommend that you point your colleagues to this video if they're not here in real time. So it's going to take me just a second to share my screen, or hopefully just a second to share my screen. All right, Ashley, is it doing what it's supposed to do? Ashley says yes. That is fantastic. That makes me happy. I'm now also just trying to find out where my chat is, because that will become important when you're having questions. All right, now I have access to the chat as well. So now that my technology is set up, here we just have kind of a visual cue to what our TLC Professional Development Series is. You've heard me say this already, so I won't spend too much more time on that. But what we're going to be talking about today is Teaching Evaluations 101, or what we call at K-State TEVALs. Now, I will make the distinction that TEVALs is an instrument that we use to measure teaching evaluations. And it's not the only instrument that you can use, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit. I have a number of objectives today, and hopefully you'll indulge me toward these objectives. The first, I'm going to discuss what TEVALs are and are not. And I think that distinction is going to be super important. I'm also going to discuss why and how we should use TEVALs, as well as how we should not use TEVALs. And I think sometimes we kind of forget what TEVALs gives us in terms of good information, and then what the limits of that information is. So that's something that's going to be part of our conversation today. I'm also going to talk to you about how you can get the most out of your TEVALs. Now, I've kind of, in some ways, like this is how to get better TEVALs. I don't mean more positive TEVALs. That's something that's going to kind of be related to your teaching practices and your course structure. What I mean is to actually get more productive TEVALs, get better information, better data from your TEVALs as we kind of go through. So if you came to this talk thinking, how do I get all my students to say good things about my class? That's not what this talk is. This talk is to kind of talk to you about what teaching evaluations is, why we use them, how we shouldn't use them, and then how to make them more productive in collecting information about your course to help you be a better teacher. There's a number of resources that I'll kind of point you to, and we'll make these slides available later. There's lots of hyperlinks in this, but we have lots of resources at the TLC webpage that you can look at. We also have some references in the university handbook. So if anyone wants to know about K-State policy that's in there, spoiler alert, I'm going to share some of that with you today. So you're going to see some of that policy in here. This is not something I'm making up. It's not something I think is a good thing. A lot of what I'm talking about is actual university policy for finding out how students feel about their experiences in our classes. And then our Engage and Sage YouTube channel, which I cannot say enough good things about. This is where we put up a lot of good teaching recommendations and tips and all of that kind of stuff. So check it out if you have not. Subscribe, like all the videos, share them with your colleagues, all of that. But we have a couple that are particularly related to the teaching evaluation experience that I'll point you to. So as we get started, I'm expecting that some of you have some preconceptions, maybe some prior experiences with TEVALs. And I'm going to use TEVALs as the shorthand for teaching evaluations as we go through. Again, it's not the only instrument that can be used, but I'm just going to use that as a shorthand because that's what we typically call them here at K-State. So I'm going to ask you to play the waterfall chat game. The waterfall chat game is basically, I'm going to ask you a question. You're going to write it in the chat, but you're not going to hit enter until I tell you go, and then all of it's going to waterfall in. This is an online teaching technique that I've picked up from some colleagues, first from Tracy Brimhall, who is absolutely amazing in our Department of English. She's actually the Kansas Poet Laureate. This is a technique that I picked up from her. So the waterfall chat, we're going to put that in there, we're going to hit go, and all of it's going to pop into there. So the question that I'm asking you is, I want you to give me one word from your experiences to describe TEVALs. I'll give you a couple seconds. Don't hit enter until I say go. All right, hit enter, please. All right, so we've got stressful, we've got data, we've got controversial, we've got intimidating, we've got overused, we've got punitive, we've got data. All right, so we've got a lot of different perceptions about TEVALs. So what we're going to do now is we're going to focus in a little bit more, and I want you to tell me one negative thing about TEVALs. Same rules. You're going to write one negative thing, because we got kind of some ambivalence in this first kind of collection of our data here. So one negative thing about TEVALs, I'll give you about 10 seconds, then I'll tell you to hit enter. We'll all have those come into the chat at the same time. Ten seconds of silence feels like a really long time, but we have hit 10 seconds, so please hit enter. All right, now what we've got biased, we've got stressful, we've got redundant, we've got response bias, we've got complaints. All right, so we've got some negative sides. We got overused. Now, we're going to flip to the positive, because I do want us to have a little bit of a balanced, open mind as we start this conversation. I'm not going to fix all the bad things. That's not something that I am empowered to do. We'll acknowledge the bad things. We'll talk some of those through. We'll talk about how we can potentially use TEVALs better so some of those bad things don't become a little bit more overweighted than they could be. But I'm going to ask you now about one positive thing. Again, I'll give you about 10 seconds, and then we'll populate the chat. So sometimes we get a really good comment. We want to get in there first. All right, hit enter, please. All right, so we've got informative, we've got possibly informative, we've got release valve, we've got listening, we've got feedback, and we've got actionable. All right, so we have the potential for TEVALs to be both good and evil. And that is something we do kind of acknowledge. And I'm going to tell you that I have no way to keep students from saying inappropriate things on TEVALs. That is often the case that people ask me, but if we give students a free response box, they can write what they want. And there's no mechanism that exists here that I can do, or anything at K-State that we can do to keep your students from saying inappropriate things. There's just really nothing that we can do to kind of alleviate that. But what we can do is maybe make some of the way that we administer TEVALs and some of what we include on the TEVALs get us to more productive data than a student just saying something mad and snarky and inappropriate about our classes. So I've been talking about TEVALs as if you know what I'm talking about. So just to make sure, TEVALs is actually a shortening of the phrase teaching evaluations. That's not quite true. That's not really what TEVALs are. What they are instead are student evaluations of teaching. And in the literature on this, they're actually referred to as SETs. So student evaluations of teaching and teacher evaluation or teaching evaluations are not the same thing. And the reason they're not the same thing is because these are actually student perception data. It is not a measure of how well you taught. It is not a measure of what your students learned. It is a customer satisfaction rating that they provide at the end of your course that they can use anything that they want to do to prompt and inspire what it is that they put. So they are student perception data. They are not, as I mentioned, direct measures of teaching effectiveness or excellence. That's not what they do. So even though we have an item that says, this was, this instructor was effective or something like that, it's not really a measure of your effectiveness. Your measure of effectiveness would have to be something more directly measured based on what your students learned, for instance. They're also not the only metric that can or should be used to evaluate teachers. And this is something we often make the mistake of at our university, and other universities do this too, where the people who are empowered to make decisions about teachers, so department heads, promotion and tenure committees, those sorts of things, will often overuse TEVALs. And I think that's when people are talking about overused in the comments. They'll often overuse TEVALs to provide information about how good a teacher that person was, when it's not really what TEVALs do. And they're also not objective or bias-free. There's a lot of things that can kind of impact the ratings that students give you. They can be based on the instructor. They can be based on something the student did themselves that didn't go well in the class. So there's a lot of things that can potentially change those ratings on the TEVALs that have nothing to do with how well the instructor taught that class. So these are things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about TEVALs. We have to understand the pros as well as the cons. Now, why we use TEVALs, it's a standardized form of anonymous student feedback in every course they take. Now, I put every, it's not really every, because you're supposed to do some evaluation. There are other instruments that could be acceptable as well. TEVAL is the one that is most commonly used, but there is supposed to be an anonymous form of student feedback in every course they take. TEVAL is not always the instrument. Now, because this is standardized, there is also the perception that you can compare one teacher to another. So you say, I teach my class, and my class is a small seminar style class that everybody's engaged in, everybody's excited about, and I get a 4.8 out of 5, let's say. Someone else teaches a large class in my department that's not really popular, that students don't really love the content about. The person does a great job, but the students just aren't jazzed about the content. They have to take it for a general education requirement, for instance. That person gets a 4.2. People might be tempted to say the person with the 4.8 is better than the person with the 4.2. Those sorts of comparisons are not appropriate. You're not teaching the same class, the same cohort, same all of those kinds of things. So it's important to understand that while this is standardized, meaning that students are often answering the same questions about different classes, the comparison of class to class or instructor to instructor is not appropriate. So this is something we need to keep in mind. Now, I'm going to share with you as we go through some of what the university handbook says about this to kind of see what the governance process is and some of the policies that guide our practices and behavior. So first of all, and this is, if you hit that link, it'll take you to the place. So if you want to see this later, but I'll give you the text and I'll highlight the stuff that is most important. This is from the section on student feedback on classroom instruction. The yellow portion that I've highlighted here, you can read the rest if you would like, is that student feedback on classroom instruction is an important source of information in the evaluation of teaching effectiveness. So what this is saying is we do want this information, and we do see this information as somewhat useful. And it gives us some instructions about how it is we could collect that information. So it's saying we can use a form. The form should be administered and collected under control conditions that assure students' anonymity. So the students are protected in terms of their anonymity so that we don't know who they put. or what they put. So we can't connect the student back to their comments. Now, obviously, it may be the case that if Ashley took my class and she had a very negative experience, if she talked about that idiosyncratic negative experience, I might then know who Ashley is. But the way that TEVALs are set up is the instructor does not receive the feedback until the grading has ended. So the day after final grades are due for submission, that's when the instructor gets TEVALs to sort of alleviate the possibility that an instructor could retaliate against a student who gave them a negative comment. So that is something that is there to protect the students. And the hope is the students being anonymous would allow them to be honest, not necessarily just negative, but honest about their experiences in the class that would provide better data for the instructor to continue to teach their class excellently. And by the way, I have the chat open in the background, and people have questions or want to raise their hand or whatever, absolutely chime in. Continuing in the university handbook, it says that we shall collect student feedback for each course and section that we teach. So if you teach a course at K-State, there should be an opportunity for your students to provide anonymous feedback about their experiences with the class. And you might say, but I have a class with one student, or I have a one-on-one kind of performance-based class or something like that. What happens there? Well, we actually do have some exceptions. So individualized classes, there is an exception that the students are not necessarily going to provide that same feedback because they cannot be protected in terms of their anonymity. So if Ashley and I are taking class one-on-one, I know all the comments are Ashley's. And Ashley might feel some pressure to say good things about me or those sorts of things. So there are exceptions for very, very small one-on-one classes. Now, how we set them up, and we're not done talking about TEVALs and how they should be used, but how we set them up, just to provide this a little bit of logistical background, is right now we do them all online. Before COVID, you had the opportunity to do them in person in your class. You'd actually get a packet and you would administer them to the class, and those envelopes would be sent back to the Teaching and Learning Center. Someone would scan them all, and then you would get a report. You would also then get all the hard copies, so you could then read all those comments. Now, they're all online. So you had the option before COVID, but since COVID, it's all been moved online. And what happened is actually administered through Canvas. To set them up, if you go into Canvas and you look on the left side at the top of that margin, there's something that says account. If you click account, you can then go to TEVAL, and then you can do new TEVAL. And what it will do is it'll give you the classes that you're teaching as options, and you can decide which TEVAL you want to create. And we have a step-by-step video tutorial that you can hit this link, and Tucker Jones, a former staff member at the TLC, will show you how to set up your TEVALs. So it's a really easy process. Once you've done it a couple times, it's actually kind of intuitive. And I'll talk you through some of the things you might want to do as you're setting those up. When you're doing this, you should do some prep. You should do some getting ready so your TEVALs are going to be as productive as they can. First of all, you're going to want to know when your TEVAL is going to be available. So the TEVAL is going to be available to your students starting on a certain date, and then it's going to close at a certain date. It should be, and I'm only saying this because we've actually had people not do it, it should be toward the end of your class. So if you're teaching an 8-week class in the first half of the semester, it should be toward the end of that 8-week class. If you're teaching a second half of the semester class or a full fall semester class, typically we're talking the last couple weeks of class. I do not recommend myself doing it just finals week. That's a period where your students are going to be particularly overloaded. They're going to be feeling pressured and overwhelmed, partially probably by you. And then saying, you know, given all the craziness that I'm putting you in, all the stuff I'm making you do, did you like my class? That might not be the best time for the kind of reflect. So I myself tend toward the second to last week or last week of class to have students reflect on most of their course experience at that point. It's also easier for me at that point to have reminders go out to let them know that, hey, please get that done. Your TEVALs can be open all the way up until the day that grades are due. For those of you who are new to K-State or don't remember, grades are typically due the Tuesday, the end of day Tuesday after finals week. So you can have your TEVALs open that long. They will then close. The report is ready the next morning for the instructor. Again, you go into Canvas, you go into account, you go to TEVALs. It'll have reports there that you can review and download. I also recommend you have some text. for your first electronic invitation message, because if you don't, they're going to get this auto-generated awful thing that basically says, you are in EDC 943, please complete the TEVAL. And they'll be like, I don't even know what EDC 943 is, you know? So I will typically, and I'll give you an example of this, have an email that's a little bit easier for my students to understand, that they understand they're creating it for my class and not a different instructor, that encourages them to do, you know, honest feedback and stuff like that. Again, you'll see my example here in a second. But there's going to be a first message. There's also going to be messages that are sent with the reminders. Again, if you do not specify it, it's going to be a system-generated message that looks like spam to your students. So this is something that I highly recommend that you personalize at least a little bit so they know it's you and your class. You will also, and this is something I feel is very underused on our campus. I've sat on a lot of promotion and tenure committees. I've seen a lot of people's TEVALs. A lot of people come and say, hey, I want to do better in my class. Can you look at my TEVALs? And I'll look at them and say, oh, you just did the default. Because the default, it will give you a certain number of rating scale items, and it will give you one free response box that just says additional comments. I myself, for a long time, didn't know you could do anything more than that. And what I found is I wasn't getting great information. You know, in that additional comments box, a student might say, like the class. While that's fun to read, I don't know why they like the class. I don't know what I should be doing. Conversely, they might say, hated the class. Again, I don't know what they hated. So it doesn't allow me to actually use the TEVAL in any productive way. So one of the things that I absolutely recommend is that you target questions toward your students to get the data that will allow you to either keep doing the good things or to make revisions to make your class better. So think about, I'm going to encourage you to think about additional items that you would include as rating scale or free response data. And I'll give you kind of examples of both that I use in some of my classes. And then instructions for completion. I think overall, the TEVAL kind of system is fairly user-friendly with two caveats. The first is it's really easy to forget to save. If you forget to save and you hit next or back or any of that, your stuff is gone. So I recommend saving often as you're kind of working through. And I've had a number of times where I didn't do that and I had to re-upload my information. By the way, when I say that I have this information ready, I have a Word doc that I prepare all of my items in ahead of time, and then I copy and paste from the Word doc into the TEVALs. The other part that's a little bit suboptimal is you have to include instructions for completion of each item. So what that means is your free response item might be, please tell me what you liked about the class. You have to have instructions before that for your students to complete the item. So often my instruction will be something like, please answer the following question as honestly as you can, or something like that. But even when the item itself has the instructions, you still have to include instructions for the item. I don't know a workaround for that. It's kind of annoying when you're doing it, but I do want to make you aware. Another thing that I feel is underused is the faculty information form, or what's called the FIF. So when you're doing this, you have the opportunity to actually complete a short survey about your class and about your circumstances that semester. So you'll be asked things like, how is your teaching load compared to others in your department? You'll be asked, did you make all the course decisions for this class? You'll ask, hey, were the students learning? You know, are they putting enough effort to learn this semester versus other semesters, and those sorts of things? So you can provide a little context for what that experience was. And there's also a free response field here. So if you're doing a new thing, so you're saying, hey, I taught this class as a flip class, I've never done that before, I would put that here because this provides some context for people who might be evaluating your TEVALs, including you a couple of years later. Why was this one a little bit different than other ones? Or you might say, hey, I had a big academic dishonesty issue in this class that might have affected some students' experiences. Putting that on there and then that being an official part of your TEVAL that maybe shows, you know, maybe a little bit more negative ratings than you might otherwise get, might provide a little bit of context again for you looking back, but also for an evaluator. So this is something I highly recommend. For instance, during COVID, you know, often I was recommending that when people would put, I taught this course as a hybrid course when I had never taught in that modality before. So it gives a little bit of context for the comments that then come from that class. So you can put anything you want in there. Highly recommend that you do it. And it provides more information both for you and for the people who might be reading it for other reasons. Now, how we should use TEVALs, and this is something we should perk up about. So if you've been, I know how to create TEVALs and I've been zoning out, get back into this, because how we should use TEVALs and how we often actually use TEVALs are not the same. And the first point I want to make here is that TEVALs are formative, not summative assessment. And I've been talking a long time, so I'm going to ask someone to tell me, what is the difference between formative and summative assessment?
I think about formative as being feedback you can use to make a change, whereas summative is like a final conclusion.
Perfect, right? So formative assessment is it's given me feedback. And by the way, you said feedback to make a change. Sometimes the feedback is don't change a thing, right? Sometimes the feedback is these are the really good things. Please don't change those, right? So it's telling you how you would potentially change moving forward. And sometimes that change is to not change. Summative assessment, as you nicely said, that's the final conclusion. That's how good you are. Well, I tell my students all the time, we should be advocating growth mindsets, not fixed mindsets, right? We are not who we will be. Who we are right now isn't going to be who we are in 2 years and all of those kind of things. That's true of our students. It's also true of us. So when I see my numbers, when I see the numbers of a colleague that I'm evaluating, that's not who they are. It's not their essence as a teacher, right? That was a single data point and a single point of time. And it's important that we understand that. So we want to create an opportunity to get more formative assessment. And in my opinion, the TEVAL in its default form does not do a real good job of creating the opportunity for formative assessment. I do think that TEVALs provide useful data to inform our teaching when we modify them to do so. And I also think we absolutely have to take into account that there's potential for lots of bias in TEVALs. There's so many ways that this can happen. I'm just going to note two big categories of bias. One are regarding instructor demographics, right? There are gender effects. There are race ethnicity effects. There are gender identity effects. There are sexual orientation effects. There are effects related to physical appearance. There are effects related to ability. There's effects related to whether or not you're from the United States or you speak from an accent from another country. There are a lot of things that could potentially be biased in their responding. It's important that we acknowledge that when we're using those TEVALs later on. That cannot be divorced from the ratings that our students have put out. The second potential source of bias are for the course demographics. So here I'm talking, is it a big lecture introductory style course that a lot of people take versus that special topics over level class where everybody loves the content? Is it the really scary course in the discipline? Is it the course that's not very scary in the discipline? Is it the easy course, if we even have those, right? So those sorts of things potentially put people at advantages and disadvantages, and those have to be taken into account when we're subjectively evaluating those TEVALs later. Now, talking about that subjective evaluation, we should not use TEVALs in some ways. Number one, TEVALs should not be, you see not is in all caps, should not be the only or even the most important metric used in evaluating instructors. So when we're talking about promotion, tenure, merit evaluation, what we sometimes call PTME, this should not be the only thing that is used to evaluate instructors. I've said that 2 times. I'll probably say it more before we're done this conversation. And the reason I'm saying it so many times is I've sat in a lot of meetings where it is the only metric that is used to evaluate teachers. And often it's the one instructor effectiveness number that people will use to carry how good that instructor is. That doesn't tell you how good there is. And in fact, there's lots of ways to figure out how good that person is and how well they taught. And these are a number of other videos that I would definitely point you to in terms of thinking about how to demonstrate your teaching excellence. I think as instructors, when we're trying to get teaching jobs, when we're trying to get teaching awards, when we're trying to get retained, when we're trying to get promoted, when we're trying to get tenured, we should actively try to demonstrate our teaching excellence. And these videos contain a lot of ways that you can potentially do that. In those demonstrating your teaching excellence videos, I actually give 10 ways to demonstrate your teaching excellence. TEVALs is one. TEVALs is one of those 10 ways. There are 9 other ways and 9 other ways that I probably like more than TEVALs that we can use to demonstrate how good a teacher we are. I think TEVALs are informative. I think we should use them, but they are limited to student evaluations of their perceptions in your class. That is not how good a teacher you are. It's information, but it's not the information we often think it is. Now, if you say, well, Don can think that, but we can, use them however we want. No, we can't. University Handbook says we can't. And in fact, you can see it right there in highlight. Student feedback should never be the only source of information about classroom teaching. I can't say it clearer than that, right? But these are the directives that govern our behavior at our institution. TEVALs cannot be the only thing that we use to evaluate classroom teaching. Says further, several types of evidence should be used And then it goes on to say what some of those might be. And I've highlighted just a couple, but there's more in there, as you can see. Peer evaluation. Having someone sit in your class who knows about teaching to kind of comment on your teaching practices, talk about the wonderful things you do, the things you could improve, that's better than TEVALs, because now what happens is you have someone who actually knows what teaching looks like do the evaluation. One of the comments one of my colleagues had once made is that TEVALs is kind of the interesting situation where we ask the people least able to tell us at the worst possible time how we taught that semester, right? And now I'm not saying that student feedback is not important, but I'll say that most of my students are not trained as teachers. So they might not get some of the things that I'm trying to do. Someone else might say, yeah, the students didn't like it because it was rigorous. There are actually great expectations in the class. So peer evaluation is going to be important. Course materials are going to be important. Sometimes those TEVALs are a little lower because that class had a lot of work in it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In providing those course materials, those syllabi, those reading lists, the assessments that you do, that would provide some context for how you teach. That's more demonstration of your practices, which I think is really important in evaluating people as teachers. Innovating teaching materials, special teaching activities outside the university. We have a president who has given us a strategic plan about things like community engagement, right? A lot of times, some of the things we do don't happen in a classroom. We should probably take some initiative in putting that as part of our teaching portfolios to let people know that we did that and that went well. Further, faculty members are free to supplement or to submit supplemental student views from instruments or other methods of their choice. So I've mentioned TEVALs is one instrument. You can do other things. And I know a number of my colleagues, I can't see many of you right now because I can only see the couple of you in the corner because I'm sharing my screen, but a number of my colleagues have talked in previous chats that we've had that they have an instrument that they use to get kind of a reflection on their entire course. Do that, summarize that, submit that. These are other ways to kind of show how maybe your students actually gained the learning that they were supposed to be gaining in your class, not just that they thought it was fun. And I'll take this comment to say as a brief side note, I mentioned this a couple times, TEVALs are not the only way to get student feedback. I recommend that you use formal and informal ways to inform your teaching. One of the things I did recently in one of my lecture classes is I said, hey, how's the lecture experience going for you? And I had them kind of give me a single word, right? And I created a word cloud from that. I said, give me a single word that describes your lecture experience. And it's fun. One person out of the 135 who took it put boring. And that's the one that kept me up at night. But like 100 put engaged, right? Seeing a word cloud with the students' experience, like 100 put engaged and one person put boring over here, that's kind of cool, right? And I asked them, what do you like about it and those sorts of things. That provides me information at the mid-semester point that I can then potentially change trajectory. So if all of my students said boring, I got to think, well, what am I doing in this class to not engage my students? That can give you a little bit of opportunity at the mid-semester to say, hey, what can I do? Easiest kind of one, and this actually comes from the AQ teacher training course. A couple of people on this call have done the AQ teacher training. From the AQ teacher training, they say for your mid-semester evaluation, 3 things. What should I start doing? What should I continue doing? What should I stop doing? Real easy. Qualitative data kind of comes in. You can see some patterns. I will put kind of the point, and this relates to mid-semester evaluation as well as for TEVALs. You're not obligated to make the changes your students suggest. So students say, and this happened to one of my colleagues once, they all get together and said, we don't want exams anymore. You can decide that you're going to explain the reason for why you have exams, but you can continue to have exams. It's not a democracy in that your students can outvote you, right? That's not how that works. But it is a situation where that would be informative. Maybe your students don't understand the reason for why you're using exams in your class. Now, how to get the most of our TEVALs. And again, I originally kind of thought about this as how to get better TEVALs, but I don't mean more positive. I mean more productive. How can we get the information that makes us a better formative evaluation of my teaching? First, I'm going to announce and explain the value of my TEVALs to my students. So I'm going to tell them, this is important to me. I read these, I take these seriously. I want to know what you think. And I'm going to personalize the message to my students. I'm not just doing the auto-generated message that TEVAL creates in Canvas. I'm going to create something a little bit more personal so they know it's coming from me and that I take these seriously. I'm going to do it in person as well. I'm going to tell them in class and or via video announcements depending on the modality. So some of the videos that I kind of linked to earlier, I'll actually share with my students and saying, this is what I think TEVALs are important, and this is why I think students should participate in that process. So I'm going to let my students know these are important to me. I'm also going to share with them an SGA video that was made. So our Student Governing Association actually made a video to instruct students about how to treat their TEVALs. So how to make these better at formative assessment. And one of the recommendations might be something like, don't just say negative, awful stuff. Make a constructive comment. Don't say the class sucks, because saying the class sucks doesn't change anything. Saying we didn't have enough time to do the final project is actually constructive feedback the instructor can then evaluate. So these are some of the things the students are telling other students to make this better for formative assessment. Then teach my students how to complete them productively. So tell them things like, all honest, constructive feedback I will take seriously. If you say Don is awesome and he should get a raise, I love that. That makes me feel good, but I don't know why, right? So maybe put something in there about what your positive experiences are. And then make your students your collaborators in shaping the future of your class and teaching. So I'll tell my students things like, I want this class to go well in the future. If you think there's things that I should keep doing, tell me what those are. If you think there's things I could change, that's great, but tell me how I should change them. And then this is now information that I can make decisions about. I'm not obligated to take the suggestions, but it's information that I can decide how I'm going to change my class in the future. So this is a sample message to my students. And by the way, if you decide to take any of this and use any of this verbatim, more power to you. Hit copy, paste, do this if it works for you, except for the part at the bottom that says Don. But what it says here is that, hi, everyone. This is your invitation to complete the student evaluation. I tell them it's called TEVAL because they might not know that. For Psych 110 this semester, I love learning with you and I appreciate hearing your feedback about the course. I take these very seriously. I want to know what worked and what didn't. I want to know what I should keep doing and what I should stop or change. I want to hear about your experiences in Psych 110. And then I say, please click the link and complete the TEVAL. I hope all is well, Don. So you keep everything but the Don if you wanted to. If you're teaching Psych 110, if you're teaching a different course, you'd have to change that part too. But send this message out, right? Let them know these are serious. This is important to me. And then the best #1 practice for getting your students to complete the TEVAL is give them time in class to complete it. Even though it's online, doesn't mean you can't say, hey, next Tuesday, beginning of class, I'm going to give you the opportunity to complete the TEVAL online, bring a device, a laptop, phone, whatever, that you'll be able to complete those because I found those really important. This is the #1 way to get those completion rates up. If you do not do this in class, for most classes, you're probably going to be under 50% in terms of your response rate on TEVALs. It's really, really hard when you're trying to make decisions about your class when you've only got, a third of your students giving you feedback. If you do it in class and give them time to do it, you're going to get more feedback provided students are attending your class. Further, and this one's a little controversial. Some people do not agree with me on this. This is actually how our university interprets some of our handbook. Do not give incentives or an extra credit. What this does is it kind of looks like a quid pro quo, that I'm giving you points for giving me TEVALs, which some students think implies they have to say good things. That might not be the case. That might not be the reality of the situation, but that is an issue. Some people say, well, what about, 80% of my students do the TEVALs and everyone gets the extra credit? I got a little bit of an ethical issue when my grade is dependent on someone else. So that's a little bit of an issue that I have there. That is something some of our colleagues do. I'm not a fan. But one of the things that I'll empower all of you to do, not that you need my permission, is you can disregard any of my kind of specific recommendations. Be careful not to violate university policy, though. I also recommend, you got to use those supplemental items. The TEVAL as a default, I do not think is a wonderful instrument for formative assessment. What this is going to do is allow us to kind of provide some organization for the kind of response we want from our students. And it's going to be targeted data collection, right? As a researcher, if I want to know what people are doing about something, I ask a targeted question toward that. And I think sometimes when we don't use those research skills in our teaching domain, it's just a missed opportunity. So what will happen is I will do supplemental items that target data collection. I'll share with you what some of these look like in terms of the domains, and then I'll show you lots of specific examples I use in my class. Again, if any of these work for you, take them, use them. That's something that if they find helpful, absolutely do that. So I'm going to provide opportunities for constructive feedback. I'm going to ask about things they liked. I'm going to ask about things they didn't like that I can't change. Again, this is the wise Tucker Jones kind of told me about this one. Because sometimes what happens is students will be like, I hated this aspect about the course, but I know it needs to be part of the course. Right? So, I hated wearing closed-toed shoes in the lab, but I understand I have to wear closed-toed shoes. So something like that lets you know no change is expected. Right? They're just venting. That's fine. But there might be other things that they know are in your power. And those are things I might take a little bit more under advisement. I'm also going to ask about their progress toward my student learning outcomes, toward those SLOs. So this is not as good data as their actual demonstrated progress, so how well they did on those assignments. It's not that good. But if my students think they developed their voice in my ETSI 943 class, if my students just like think they have a better understanding of how humans develop, that is something that is helpful for me to know. Hey, it looks like they felt like I was probably covering the information and doing assessments the way that I should in those areas. It also can be used to provide specific assignment and assessment perceptions. So how did you feel about the missions in this class? Did you feel like the study guide assignment was fair? Did you like doing the PSA at the end? These are things that are helpful for me. It could be something like, do you feel like you needed more words in that final project? You can get as targeted as you want to get your students' perceptions of very specific aspects of your class, rather than hope they say something in a free response that has no kind of direction given. You can also ask them about specific teaching practices. Did you like the discussions? Did you like the student-led discussions? Did you like the peer reviews that we did? Did you like the way that we facilitated the group activities? You can ask about those kinds of things. And for instance, in my classes, I might ask them about aspects of peace. So for those of you who saw me present earlier this semester, you understand that peace is a big part of my teaching philosophy. That's an acronym that stands for preparation, expertise, authenticity, caring, and engagement. I might ask my students, was I prepared? Did I show expertise? Did I appear authentic? Did I appear to care? Did I appear engaged? And that would give me some indication about whether or not I was actually doing what I wanted to do. And I might ask, did every student feel welcome in my class? Did I actually teach inclusively? Did I feel like I valued my students, all of my students, no matter who they were? I might ask some questions about that because that's important to me in the environment that I create as a teacher. And then if I have a co-instructor or a GTA, I might have separate questions about how did Ashley do as a GTA in this class? Because sometimes what happens is Ashley says, I TA'd all semester and I have nothing to show for it. Well, maybe there'll be a couple questions about Ashley's performance from the student perspective that Ashley can potentially use when Ashley goes on the job market. And for Ashley, this is not a hypothetical, right? Ashley on the job market, so something like this might be helpful. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'm just going to kind of show you, these are some of the specific items that I use when I'm setting up my TEVALs. So course was designed in a way to help me learn. The lectures were engaging. The course expectations were reasonable. These are more important to me than those kind of overarching, very generic, very vanilla questions that we ask about every class in the default. I also asked things like this. The instructors supported me in my learning. The instructors were inclusive of diverse groups. Overall, I had a positive experience. These are things that I want to know the answers to. Now, this is rating scale data, and this is great, but I also have free responses. So I'll ask, what did you like? What did you not like? What would you change? What's the most valuable thing you learned? What was your favorite memory? And I'm a huge fan of 6-word essays. I don't know if Lisa Rubin is on the call, but I know that she's a huge fan of this as well. She's published on it. I like the students to describe my class in 6 words to kind of give me an essence of that. And this shows me what stuck out to my students about that classroom experience. And someone who has not taken my class, who is reviewing these materials, get a much better flavor of what that class was about when they're reading the answers to these kinds of questions. So to get the most out of our TEVALs, we're going to use these TEVALs to inform our decisions, right? We're not obligated to do the suggestions that our students gave us, but I definitely think we take them as information as a formative assessment. I recommend we use them to inspire tweaks. Sometimes what happens is, again, not being good experimentalists in our teaching lives, a class doesn't go great sometimes, so we change everything for the next semester. That's not what you would do if a research study didn't work. You would change a single variable and you'd look to see the effects. So I recommend you teach the same way. You change a variable or two based on the feedback and see if the experience improves. I'm in this for the long game. I'm looking to get my perfect course, over a course of time and have that evolve to amazingness, hopefully. I'm not going to change everything semester to semester. Making these tweaks is much more sustainable and actually makes it much easier to identify the things that are going well and the things that maybe need a little bit more thought. And do not chase TEVALs. What I've seen a lot of people do, they get some TEVALs that maybe they're not as excited about. They make all the changes the students requested. And then what happens is next semester students are even more unhappy because all the students who didn't suggest those changes were quite happy with it the way it was. So use these as informative. Look to see if they fit your course, its purpose, your teaching philosophy, your teaching practices, but don't make every change suggested in the TEVALs. It'd be very unlikely that those students, just those couple of students maybe, really identified the ways to make your class optimal, think about it, use these as information. And in conclusion, TEVALs and other measures of student evaluations from teaching have biases and limitations that cannot be ignored. And in particular, those numbers can kind of have those effects. Those inappropriate comments can have effects. I think when we ask more targeted questions, we're less likely to have some of the things happen, but we're not completely unlikely. I can't eliminate, but I can reduce the possibility. They should not as underlined before it was in all caps, now it's underlined. I think it was highlighted in yellow at 1.2, should not be used alone in evaluating teachers. This is one of a host of opportunities to get information about that person's class. And they can be administered in ways that increase the response rate and the utility of the data. The data are important to help us optimize our teaching. And I think sometimes we see these as, this negative thing that people are kind of talking about before. It doesn't have to be that way. And they provide students the opportunity to inform their teaching. This is what we're supposed to be doing. So at this point, that's my email if anyone wants this. We'll post the slides online so you don't have to email if you don't like. I'm going to assume that you remember that I've asked for questions as I stop my share so we can go back to Brady Bunch mode or gallery mode so I can kind of interact a little bit more. But at this point, I am very interested in any questions that you all might have about TEVALs or the student evaluation of teaching process in general. And Rebecca, looks like you've put an amazing source in the chat that I'll have to check out later. Thank you for dropping that in.
I wanted to highlight the importance of having other ways of getting student feedback. And to give an example from my course last year, I had asked my students during class, I had asked them to give at the end of the semester, like what went well, what feedback, and it was very informal. But I had one student say, I give my students every class a preparation guide that goes along with their readings. And one student said, the preparation guides were really a lot. And I don't think that we should have them for every class. And every other student just turned around and went, oh, no, those are so helpful. And I thought, oh, I'm so glad that I'm doing this in class, because if I had read that, I would have thought, oh, maybe I should. But to see the rest of the class react and be like, no, those are really helpful, we really like them. It gave an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about, are there ways that we could make these feel less burdensome to the students who feel like it's a lot, while still maintaining the aspects that the other students really like. And so having some time in class to discuss with students things that are going well and things that could be improved gives you I think, better idea of how all students are interpreting the things that you're doing in class, and allows you to not focus on that, like, oh, one student said that they didn't like how these things worked. And so it kept me from making a mistake in going the opposite direction and focusing on that one piece of student feedback.
That is an excellent example. And if you're going to do something like that, and Andy, I know you do this, just make sure you have kind of a safe space for your students to actually kind of share their feedback and their experiences.
Yeah, Don, I'm thinking about, you said, not to revamp everything based on a little bit of student feedback. When we do that, and I have colleagues who do it, and not only are they actually stressed out, but it means that they're teaching a brand new class every semester, and that class itself hasn't been tested. And so I think that they think that they're improving, but they're really just giving students over and over version 1 of the class. And I have a hard time seeing, maybe you'll get lucky and you got it perfect right out of out of the gate, but probably not. And so it just feels like they're kind of staying in a rookie spot all the time and offering students doggy pancake versions of the class over and over.
That is a fantastic point, because the point I make when I'm teaching my principal's college teaching classes, I never teach a class right the first time. And often it's about the third time that I'm like, all right, I think I've figured this out. Because oftentimes that first time I'm barely, able to keep on top of the prep. The second time I make some adjustments. The third time I'm like, all right, I've got a handle on this thing. But yeah, if we're starting from scratch every time, we never get to that third semester where it's feeling like it's working. That's going to be a problem for us. So what are comments, questions, concerns, experiences that people want to contribute?
I just finished a 8-week class, and my goal was to get 70% of my students to finish TEVALs. I got 60%. which was 15 students in this class. So it was an all right number. But it felt harder to get online students to do it because we don't have them in a captive space where I can put them in the room. When I have
I
been
would say
teaching,
60% for an online class is pretty good.
okay, I want it better.
I'm not saying you didn't want better. I'm saying good
Yeah.
job. Nice work.
Thanks. Well, I welcome other suggestions for how to get those numbers up, or if in online settings in particular.
There's not a whole lot of information in literature. This comes up every year. There's not a lot out there. What I'm doing is I'm incorporating, some of the recommendations in literature, show them it's important, tell them you care, tell them how to do it, give them a time span in which to do it, which is not the worst time in their lives at the end of the semester when they're overloaded. But like I said, far and away, the best one is to give class time. If you don't have class time, that you're kind of missing the biggest lever we can pull.
I include it as like part of a module towards the end of the semester. So like these are your assignments for this week. Like this is what you have to do, and just include it explicitly, like complete your TEVAL this day. So in that way, like that's as close as I've figured out how to get it as like giving class time. And then I also make sure to not give them quite as much content for that module that I would normally give, so that it's like, no, this is part of this week's assignment, is that you do this. And then like Don said, highlight all the why we do it, give them information on how I want them to do it, why it's important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So one other thing I'll add is that I mentioned you can find other ways to supplement that is not TEVAL. Often in my class, I have end of class reflections. Those might be top 10 things they learned, something recommendation they make to a student next semester, those sorts of things. So it is getting me information about their experience in my class, but it's not TEVAL. And I think it's a little bit more related to the content that I'm teaching and those sorts of things. So you can do that to collect formative information about your class. It's just not technically TEVAL. And I invite that you do those things. And this is a little closer to what, Andy was talking about a little bit earlier with their example. So you can do that. You can make that an assignment. You can have points associated with that, but it's not TEVAL. So we are a little past time. I've been trying to get us done by 11:50 each time. So I'll stick around for a minute if anyone has any additional questions. Do you want to remind you, we have a opportunity to get a teaching professional development certificate through the TLC. Losing my words here right now. I apologize for that. We have a post-event survey that we'd love you to complete. Next week, we got an amazing event by Rebecca Paz and Eric Thompson on supporting first-generation students. And I really appreciate you taking some time for our PD series today. For anyone watching asynchronously, thank you for tuning in whenever you're tuning in. And again, if anyone wants to stay here for a minute, I'll be here. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.